of the rezoning hearings. In the morning session, we worked on the 42A offices on South Wairarapa in Carterton. And in the second session, we're going to hear on some of the Masterton rezoning requests, which are split into Masterton and Masterton Rural Lifestyle Zone. And we have Mr. Horrell up first. Yes, thank you, Mr. Horrell. And you've a summary statement. Would you like to take us through that, please?
Yes. Shall I take paragraphs 1 and 2 as read and go from paragraph 3?
Yes, just before you do, let me just acknowledge some new attendees online. Tori McDonnell. Good morning, Tori. Can you hear us okay? Good morning, Tori. Are you hearing us? Okay. We've got Mr. Views. Views, are you hearing us okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Good. And you're representing the Dalziel, I believe. Is that correct? Daniel, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
Gary Daniels.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you for that. And we've heard from everyone else. We'll just check. Tori, are you online?
Yes, I am. Apologies. I'm on the road, so I'm listening audio only, but I can hear you loud and clear.
Good. That's great. We'll see you later in the day, presumably, are we?
Yeah, you sure will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Right.
Okay. So the operative plan contains 3 rural zones: the rural primary production, rural special, and rural conservation zone. There's no existing rural lifestyle zone with any rural lifestyle opportunities provided through the subdivision rules relating to the rural production and rural special zones. Through the plan review, the rural zones were revised to align with the most closely matched zone from the National Planning Standards. In addition, the rural lifestyle zone was identified as appropriate in meeting the relevant strategic direction, which in particular RE05, and providing lifestyle opportunities in the Masterton district. A comparison of the rural zones between the operative and proposed district plan are shown below. And that's that table underneath paragraph 4.
Yeah. Of course, no FUZ.
That's right, yes. The proposed district plan identifies the rural lifestyle zone as being an area of contiguous lands to the northeastern edge of Masterton. The associated rules of the rural lifestyle zone and subdivision chapters generally provide for rural lifestyle / residential activities down to 0.5 hectares. Just to remind the panel, during hearing stream 3, consideration was initially given to rezoning requests. That was specifically requesting rural lifestyle rezoning. At that hearing, I considered each of the rezoning requests against a set of criteria that a request would need to meet to be appropriate for rural lifestyle zoning. At that time, I recommended rejecting all of the rezoning requests as none of those requests met the specified criteria. And just to clarify, I've used the same criteria with this, my updated section 42A report. I note that some of the submitters appeared at that hearing to speak to their submissions, including Gary Daniel, and I believe a further submitter is also attending after this, which is Mr. Ryan. Well, not directly related to rezoning requests, I note that during hearing stream 3, various changes were recommended to the provisions of the rural lifestyle zone. I specifically highlight 2 of those. So I recommend a reduction to the extent of the rural lifestyle zone in response to Greater Wellington Regional Council's submission point, and based on an assessment by Ag First Consulting against clause 3.10 of the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land. And then point B, a recommended increase to the minimum allotment size from 0.5 hectares to 1 hectare for subdivision within the rural lifestyle zone in response to Greater Wellington Regional Council submission point and Adams and Shaw. As a result of changes recommended to the provisions of the rural lifestyle zone, the associated development yield, it's associated, oh, what have I done there? So there's been a reduction to the associated development yield, and it's noted that there would be insufficient rural lifestyle opportunities available to provide for the anticipated long-term demand in Masterton. 3 options were considered at that time, and a preliminary recommendation was provided that further investigation be undertaken by Masterton District Council to provide for additional lifestyle opportunities. This is anticipated to be via a spatial planning exercise, and I think I note further on that this is intended to commence shortly. It was, however, noted that this recommendation may be revisited following consideration of all rezoning requests addressed during this hearing stream. I'll revisit this at the adjournment of the hearing and via my reply statement once I've made a conclusion on all rezoning requests.
Just in terms of the 3 options that were considered at that time,
Mm.
you just remind the panel what they were. Do you recall what they were? For
Yes.
RLZ within Masterton.
Yes. So the options were to effectively 3 options. So 1, to retain the existing approach, identifying a rural lifestyle zone. With that, it would need to have that future capacity built in. 2, to remove the rural lifestyle zone and rely primarily on a general rural zone provision, similar to what's in
The other 2 districts.
That's right. And then 3, a hybrid approach of combining the 2.
Yes. It's so some discussion about RLZ but also discussion about the general provision in Masterton and cut districts of increasing the minimum small lot subdivision from 4 hectares to 6 hectares.
That's right.
Possibly 8.
That's right.
On a submission by Mr. Grady, I think. Yes, and others. But that, as you understood, that applied solely to Carterton land.
At this stage, that was the intent of the proposed district plan, and my preliminary recommendation is to retain the 1 approach to lifestyle in Masterton, which is by the rural lifestyle zone.
Yes. Acknowledging though that the quantum of yield delivered by a reduced RLZ and an increased minimum lot size would have an impact on yield. We see a shortfall.
It does, yes.
Thank you.
So I'll pick up again at paragraph 9.
Yes.
The total was 6 original submissions and 6 submission points, and 11 further submissions, which is made up of 18 further submission points, were received on the rural lifestyle rezoning in Masterton. The submissions related to requests for rezoning of properties from general rural zone to rural lifestyle zone. I've read the respective evidence submitted in relation to the Masterton rezoning topic. That should be specifically in relation to rural lifestyle, being that of Miss Alice Blackwell, Mr. Angus Hughes, and Mr. Ian Milner for Gary Daniel, and then Mr. Tory McDonald, Mr. Samuel Wilkie, and Mr. Alan Blyde for James and Leslie Wallace and Rosemary Laffrey. I'll respond to the evidence below, and then changes that I've recommended are provided in Appendix 2. So beginning with Gary Daniel, that is 125 Teor Road. The Miss Blackwell has supported, as supported by Mr. Hughes and Mr. Milner, who are both agricultural experts, have provided further evidence to support the rezoning of 125 Teor Road. As outlined in my Section 42A report, I was previously satisfied that the rezoning met all relevant criteria except for clause 3.10 of the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land. This matter was initially considered during hearing stream 3, where Ms Blackwell and Mr Bewes presented evidence. At that time, based on the advice of Miss Juliet Chambers of Ag First, I concluded that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that all parts of clause 3.10 were met. Additional evidence addressing clause 3.10 has since been provided by Mr Bewes and Mr Milner. This evidence has been reviewed by Ms Chambers, whose comments are attached to the statement as Appendix 1. In summary, Ms Chambers agrees with Mr Milner's conclusion that the requirements of clause 3.10 of the NPS HBL are met. And based on Ms Chambers' assessment, I'm now satisfied that the rezoning request fully complies with all criteria in clause 3.10 of the NPS highly productive land. Accordingly, I recommend that the rezoning request is accepted.
Just for the record, could you explain to the panel what the requirements of clause 3.10 of the NPS are?
Yes. Might just bring it up if you don't.
Yes, that's fine. You can share it on the screen if you.
There. Yes, I can do that. Okay. So, does that need to be enlarged?
Yep. You're right, you drive that closer. Boy, yeah.
Does that?
Yeah.
Good. So just for context, the policy, I don't want to scroll up, it might cause a migraine, but one of the policies requires avoidance of rezoning of land into rural lifestyle, except as provided for in the National Policy Statement. This clause is effectively where that would be provided for. So it sets quite a clear criteria that needs to be met. So starting with subclause 1A, that permanent or long-term constraints on land that mean the use of the highly productive land for land-based primary production are not able to be met or economically viable for at least 30 years. Now, this part of the criteria was the main matter of contention between the submitter and my expert, Ms. Chambers. I guess the economically viable was the question, which there hadn't been, sufficient economic evidence to suggest that all potential options have been considered.
Could you actually scroll to 3.7 because that will actually provide the direct context.
3.7?
Yes.
Clause 3.7?
Yes.
Or referring back to 3.10, yes.
For the panel's benefit, this is a very directive clause in the NPS that says when you're coming to zone land for rural lifestyle purposes, you must avoid highly productive land unless there's a carve-out provided or an exemption satisfied under clause 10.
Just also scroll just right back to the policies, which so policy 6, the rezoning and development of highly productive land as rural lifestyle is avoided, which then it seems a little bit odd to go twice, but that's how the
So there's a qualified avoidance, if you like, generally avoidance unless you can satisfy the provisions of 310.
That's right. And what I'll just note with 310, so all parts of point A need to be met. So B and C. So B also looking at the cumulative loss of that productive land, and that it's avoiding adverse effects on primary production and productive capacity. And then C is a environmental cost benefit analysis to identify that the benefits outweigh the costs. So these are conjunctive, so they all have to be met. It couldn't just be A and then rely on that. It has to be all three. We have to be satisfied for all three. And what I might just note for clause 2 is it sets quite a prescriptive requirement for how you assess that. So subclause 1A, which is that economic viability, has to consider all of these different scenarios. So amalgamations was one of those questions, which Ag First had indicated it could be feasible to amalgamate properties and become economically viable.
So it's just not a matter of looking at the property in isolation. You need to look at the surrounding properties and the ability to evaluate over the life of the plan.
That's right.
So that's great stuff there, but I don't, when you end up with very small blocks of highly productive land, I suppose Martinborough is a prime example where you end up with a section inside the town that's highly productive and it could be progressive. How do you, using that, I presume economically viable means profitable.
Yes.
So you actually got to make a profit, just not subsistence farming we're talking about. It's actually being economically viable to make a living off it.
Yes. And for the for a productive crop, I guess is the other qualifier there that.
Well, what's it becomes really difficult to say what's a productive crop. Yes, I can plant trees and yes, I can get a crop off it, but is that an economically viable unit in terms of sustaining me if I own an acre in the middle of Martinborough, for argument's sake? Is that enough? Is that economically viable for me to maintain that as my primary source of income?
If I was me,
So how do you, where does the economic viability sit?
I guess the and what we did find here in stream 3 is that this is intended to be a high bar, and that it does demand a level of evidence to prove that. I guess an issue that we did have was having that economic evidence and who's suitably qualified to provide that. So I guess a practical assessment goes so far, but it does need to have that economic evidence backing that to say, yes, it makes sense for these reasons, which in the case of Mr. Daniels, for the evidence provided, Mr. Milner's in particular does provide that further backing to say actually it's impractical to amalgamate those properties. It's impractical to get to that level of productive use that may have been anticipated based on the potential crops and all of the viable things that could be undertaken in 30 years.
We're hearing a lot in South Waikato and the other councils as well about turning land from agricultural use or farming use to forestry use. And yes, whilst that might be economically viable for one rotation of trees, and yes, it might be for 30 years. After 30 years, the soil is contaminated by tannins and so on. So it then is stuck in that environment that then may not be viable. So it's not a simple, it's a very subjective view about what's economically viable, I would have thought. And so you're going to get lots of variations. And so, Ms. McGrady, her submission talked about the viability of, you got 6 acres, 6 hectares, and is that viable given it's a rocky part close to the river compared to another 6 hectares that might be a pack back, that might have a different sort of thing on it. So it's that's what I just asked.
Yeah. I mean, I can I acknowledge the issue. I don't think I can talk further to it. But yeah, it's, I guess, acknowledge the constraints that come with this national policy salmon. Our interpretation has been to give effect to this clause, which is, as I say, quite prescriptive. And that has required us to go through all of those different scenarios and confirm that they're not there.
I'm pleased to say that for the dams, I'm just thinking, think of where we've got other small blocks that are sitting, not being used because they're not productive and it costs too much, and yet we can't rezone them or whatever. People haven't asked to rezone. So
Yeah, just another thought on that. The question of a small block being amalgamated with a neighbour, and then improving the viability of the overall block is probably another situation like we see with this Ardsley, with a neighbouring dairy farm over the back of it. You know,
That's right. Absolutely.
that needs to take into consideration too.
Yes.
Yeah.
To be honest, you could actually write a book on the scenarios that could pop up out of this.
Yeah.
And you could never, ever talk more.
I guess something to note for the councils are one of the first councils to go through this process and really see the implications of this national policy statement, which there are intended to be changes to be made, most notably to remove land use capability 3. The timing for that is, I think we're anticipating to hear something in the next month or so on that. But I guess the issue for us is we have to continue as we're going, and to wait may result in delay of the overall decision.
Yes. Two of the consultants acting for SMITers have usually pointed out the speech of Mr. Bishop and Cabinet talking about the removal of class 3 land from the HP. Yes, it's useful. But the reason I actually bring that up is I think it's important that panel understand that the MPS does anticipate that there will be exceptions to rezoning high quality land or to lifestyle zoning if criteria are met. And in this instance, the criteria have been addressed by Mr. Milner and Mr. Hughes and reviewed by Ms. Chambers. And there's common agreement that clause 3.10 is met.
That's right.
Thank you. Which is essentially what you've said at paragraphs 15 and 16. Your summary statement.
Mind if I take the?
Rest is read.
I was going to say yes.
Move it.
I'll stop sharing and go back to my statement now. So picking up again at paragraph 17.
Just before you go, before you leave Daniel's matter, I'm going back to your 42A report. Previously, there was discussion in Hearing Stream 3 and your 42A on this too, on matters other than HDL, and particularly natural hazard matters. Since had Hearing Stream 9, I think, that dealt with natural hazards, that advanced the topic a little bit further. Are you satisfied now, based on your paragraphs 84 and 85, particularly 84 in your 42A, that there's no impediment from a natural hazards perspective to the rezoning of Daniel's land?
Yes, and I might just clarify significant constraint was the threshold I was looking for here. So yeah, in my view, there'd be sufficient ability through the subdivision stage to manage those hazard issues.
And so there's nothing. So Hearing Stream 9 landed on moderate risk, I think.
That's right. And as I understand, it's the rupture zone itself is the main constraint there. So that while the moderate level constraint does cover a large portion of the property, there would be an ability through those further site-specific assessments to locate the buildings away from those particular hazards.
Was there also was that particularly the fault hazard, was it?
The fault hazard, there was also bonding area at the southern end of the property. However, that hazard was less of a concern of mine. It was more the fault hazard that was the impediment to development that I'd raised.
I interrupt you. You were at paragraph 17.
17, yes. Ms Blackwell's responded to my recommendation to increase the minimum allotment size within the rural lifestyle zone from 0.5 hectares to 1 hectare and suggested a more nuanced approach, namely introducing a restricted discretionary status for subdivision between 1 hectare and 0.5 hectares. I note that this matter arises from a submission point raised during hearing stream 3 and pertains to rules and standards of the rural lifestyle zone rather than a rezoning request. As such, it falls outside the direct scope of this hearing stream. In the interest of fair process, I do not propose to comment further on Ms Blackwell's suggestion at this stage. However, I can consider the merits further should the panel request it.
Any questions in relation to the Daniels? I wonder, Ms Blackwell, are you with us at the moment?
Yeah, I'm here.
Good morning, Alice. How are you hearing us okay?
Yes, good morning.
Have you been listening in to what the discussion's been? Yes.
Yes.
I wonder, based on what's been discussed, whether you still want to proceed with your afternoon slot this afternoon. Is there anything that you would want to add based on what you've heard today?
It would only be if the panel had any questions, wanted any further explanation on the HPL assessments. But if you don't have any, then happy to let that go. I do think Mr. Daniel is going to appear in person, so he might want to speak to the submission.
Yes. I will just check the panel. Is there any questions of Mr. Buse or Ms Milner or Mr. Chambers? That's a negative. It's got exhausted. We don't have any questions of you unless you wanted to respond to paragraph 17 of the summary statement.
I guess just in that context, the shifting from a hectare to half a hectare to a hectare, that's quite a massive change to have only come through in the right of reply. And just it flicks it straight to a non-complying activity. If you breach that minimum lot size, it seems to me quite a huge jump. If you're 9,900, you're a non-complying activity. So in my view, it was just that there could be a more nuanced way if the main issue is just wastewater.
Right. And what would that nuanced way, what activity status would that involve?
Well, if you had a restricted discretionary activity status and discretion in relation to wastewater, if that's the key issue, then there's full control over managing the potential effects of that. And then also making, because there is one restricted discretionary option in there, but you have to meet the minimum lot size. And now that's gone to a hectare. It has just shifted the goalpost substantially for the rural lifestyle zone.
I just ask a question of fact of Mr. Horrell. When the area was 0.5, what was the default activity status for non-compliance with that?
Default would have it would go to non-compliant. There's no change to the cascade of rules.
There's two ways Just in the interest of efficiency, Alice, there's two ways we can deal with this. I'm happy for you to have a further discussion with Mr. Horrell about this between the close of the hearing tomorrow and the right of reply. And if necessary, we can, if there's some traction there, we can look at this as an integration issue also on the final wrap-up hearing. But there's no how can I put this? Mr. Horrell might be maintaining his position on this, given what he just said about the cascading approach, but I'm going to leave it as a voluntary discussion between yourself and Mr. Horrell. All I ask is that if there is discussions, that they be recorded in the right of reply. And if further work's needed, we can pick it up again in the integration hearing, which is the last hearing. Any thoughts on that? Firstly, from you, Ms. Black.
I'm happy with that. That sounds good to me.
That assumes it's scope, but I presume it was one of the first things to check, really, that there is scope to change the activity status, because it would have related to the activity status for not meeting the 0.5 of a hectare originally. Mr. Horrell, did you have any thoughts immediately?
I guess the only, which is something I can consider further with Ms. Blackwell, but the only potential issue I see if a change was made is how that may prejudice the submitters who initially requested the point of the 1 hectare, and whether that still was aligned with their relief sought.
Okay, well, what we might do then is ask for some further work as to what other people might be in the tent on that before, and then if necessary, I can give some directions. So let's find out who's involved initially, whether there's scope, and then we can give some directions. And it's solely ring fenced on what you've raised and what's been raised in paragraph 17 of the summary statement. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. But as far as Mr. Daniel is concerned, I don't. It's completely up to him whether he wants to attend this afternoon, but the panel doesn't sound like they have any questions for him.
I'm actually up for a bit of a clarification. Probably lost me halfway through. So, are you talking about your nuanced approach being that if there is an ability to connect the wastewater to the town system, that we should consider the 0.5 hectare?
No, it's if you can meet the standard required, so that it wouldn't be connected to the town supply, but there's a standard in the rules that wastewater has to meet in the rural lifestyle zone. So it would be some sort of disposal field standard. It wouldn't be connecting to town supply. But if you can meet that, and if that's the only issue in relation to lot size, or that's the key issue, then I can't see why you can't continue with the smaller lot size.
Albeit through a lesser activity consent rather than non-compliant, where the issue is ring fenced. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, if you can meet that standard, then you should be able to get through a restricted discretionary activity, rather than, because as soon as you go to non-complying, the problem is that as the planner considering it and applying for it, everything's on the table when really the only issue was in relation to wastewater, and then a whole lot of other issues come into it. But actually, if the only issue is really about the wastewater system, if that's the key thing, then it's easy, it's clearer if that's outlined in the rule, and that's the key issue that needs to be complied with.
Okay, I don't know if I can take that any further. Yeah. But as far as your client's concerned, as I said, we don't need to hear from him this afternoon. It's up to him. We don't need to hear from you further on that, or all agricultural witnesses. And we'll come back to you once we've had a chat to Mr. Horrell about scope and the number of parties involved in the matter raised in paragraph 17.
Thank you. I will email the district plan email address with whether Mr. Daniels is coming or not as well, and just let you know.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Appreciate it.
Okay,
Okay, now, paragraph 18, the Wallaces and Leffies.
that's right. So this relates to the rezoning request at 254 State Highway 2, which is north of Sydney and directly adjacent to the existing rural lifestyle zone. Mr. McDonald, as supported by Mr. Blythe and Mr. Wilkie, has provided further evidence to support the rezoning 254 State Highway 2. As outlined in my Section 42A report, I was previously satisfied that the proposed rezoning met all relevant criteria with the exception of 1, constraints to development, particularly related to on-site servicing, given the unknown or the known flood risks associated with the site as advised by the Council's engineering unit. And then 2 was the traffic and roading, due to the insufficient evidence that roading infrastructure can support the rezoning, and the rezoning would not impact the safety and efficiency of the roading network, in particular State Highway 2, as it would have, or potentially has direct access onto State Highway 2 at 100-kilometre speed restriction zone. Mr. Blythe's evidence addresses development constraints, including the evaluation of a development scenario involving service allotments down to 0.5 hectares. He concludes that there are no infrastructure servicing issues associated with the rezoning. I note that this evaluation is based on the minimum allotment size set out in the proposed district plan, rather than the minimum allotment size that I am currently recommending, which is 1 hectare as opposed to 0.5. While I have considered the rezoning request in the context of my current recommendations regarding minimum allotment size, I do not consider this discrepancy impacts the validity of Mr. Blythe's evidence, and if anything, the analysis adopts more of a conservative approach. I sought comments from Marsden District Council's 3 Waters Operations and Transition Manager, Mr. Steve Watt, on this matter. Mr. Watt advised that there are no further concerns relating to wastewater and stormwater that could not otherwise be managed during the subdivision consent phase. Based on this, I'm satisfied that there would not be significant development constraints. Mr. Wilkie has provided evidence that considers the traffic and roading effects associated with the rezoning. Similar to Mr. Blythe's approach, Mr. Wilkie has considered a development scenario of allotments down to 0.5 hectares. This scenario considers an internal access road off both Ardsley Lane and State Highway 2. In either case, Mr. Wilkie concludes that rezoning can be provided for while maintaining a safe and efficient roading network. I've sought comments from Marsden District Council's Roading Services Manager, Mr. Kane Jaquiri. Mr. Jaquiri has considered Mr. Blythe's evidence and advised that an internal road access from Ardsley Lane would require road widening to around 6.3 metres, which is approximately a 0.5 metre increase, and to provide for that would provide for 2 vehicles to pass safely. In addition, the scale of the development would require footpaths to be provided and streetlights where necessary. Based on Mr. Jaquiri's comments, I'm largely satisfied that those matters could be appropriately addressed during the subdivision consent phase. However, I note the feasibility of servicing the development via Ardsley Lane is contingent on the full extent of the required upgrades and widening to be implemented. I would note that the road is a private road and does not come under the control of the District Council as a road controlling authority. I do not consider that the current subdivision rules applying to the rural lifestyle zone appropriately anticipate this level of infrastructure provision. Accordingly, if the zoning is accepted, I consider that consequential amendments to the relevant subdivision rules will be necessary to ensure the servicing requirements can be adequately addressed. In relation to the access onto State Highway 2, Mr. Jaquiri has advised that Marsden District Council generally relies on the road controlling authority, the state highways, which is New Zealand Transport Authority, to comment on the potential effects on the safety and efficiency of the state highway network. Given the nature of this process, with the NZTA being a general submitter, it is not feasible nor appropriate to seek their comments at this stage. However, Mr. Chikweri has noted, based on previous advice received, the Road Control Authority is generally opposed to the creation of new direct access points onto State Highway 2, particularly along those sections that are subject to a 100-kilometre speed restriction. Mr. McDonald has acknowledged the interface with NZTA, noting that approval would be required to construct an intersection with State Highway 2. Mr. McDonald has inferred that NZTA is unlikely to oppose a new access way, as the agency did not lodge a further submission in opposition to the requested rezoning. However, I would hesitate to draw that conclusion, and notwithstanding the absence of a further submission from NZTA, consider that requirement to provide safe and adequate access onto the section of State Highway 2 would be a key matter to address during the subdivision for that site. In the absence of specific comments from NZTA, I do not consider that the effects on safety and efficiency of the state highway network can be definitively concluded at this stage. That said, I note that this matter would only arise in relation to subdivision proposals that would involve direct access onto the state highway, including an internal access road. Provided that appropriate roading upgrades and access arrangements can be assessed at the time of subdivision consent, I consider the associated effects can be appropriately managed. However, I would not recommend that provision of access into the site is being considered as a controlled activity, which cannot be declined. At a minimum, it should trigger consent as a restricted discretionary activity so that adequate access cannot be provided, that the consent can be declined. Overall, in principle, I am in support of the rezoning request, but as noted, I continue to hold reservations over the traffic and roading effects. I will reserve my position until I've heard from experts on behalf of James and Leslie Wallace and Rosemary Laffey. My preliminary view would be that the rezoning is accepted, that if the rezoning is accepted, it is subject to consequential amendments to the subdivision rules to ensure an appropriate activity status is set to allow a robust consideration of roading matters. I note, based on discussions with Marsden District Council's planning manager, the spatial planning process is expected to commence shortly. As part of this process, the subject property is part of an area that has been looked at for long-term urban growth, given its location along the northern growth corridor and gateway into Marsden. The planning manager noted that the spatial planning exercise is intended to robustly consider all northern growth opportunities in Marsden, in particular the northern corridor. The outcome of that exercise could result in future urban zoning changes. While I acknowledge that this remains outside the scope of this plan review and the consideration of the submission, it may be useful context for the submitter to be aware of, particularly in regard to any immediate plans for developing the site.
Thank you. I have an initial question, and I believe I know the answer, but I just need to get it on the record. The Wallace and Laffey submission sought rezoning of the in rural zone to a mixture of rural lifestyle and residential, east and west. Read the summary statement prepared by Alice Falloon, which addresses the general residential zone west. And it's clear that the has chosen not to proceed with that. Yes. Instead, and now seeking rural lifestyle zone of the entirety of the block. Is your summary statement in response to that revised position?
It is, yes. Okay. So the full site as opposed to just half.
your 42A was dealing just with.
In my 42A, I had assumed the full site as well.
Oh, okay.
So just for completeness, if assume the full extent, and if they were to have urban, that would, I guess, overlay that.
I think that's good. Panel. Sorry, clarification, Charles. I know it say that Ardsley Lane is a private road. Whereabouts does it begin? Base of the hill at the rise or further along?
I might need to, in fact, my mastering colleagues might be more attuned to that, but I can just quickly check on.
Just before Milford Downs, Ardsley, would it?
Yeah,
Is that because Milford Downs would be a private road too?
It comes off Manuka Street, just above 5th Street.
We put that up on the screen, please.
Because times it comes up and it doesn't turn up. So just there is Ardsley Lane and then there's a private.
There's Milford Downs.
Yeah, so you go Manuka Street and then at the beginning or end of Manuka Street, but there is another part at the very end of Ardsley Lane that is a private road.
Because of that.
So the Laffy is this property in here, comes across, and I don't think it comes all the way there actually, and comes up.
If you come down a bit. It's, no, come down.
Down this way.
Yeah, so that would be the end of. That would be private. Or is it private from there onwards? Is Milford Downs a private road?
No, it would be from the top where they have Manuka. Yeah. Manuka, and then you go up, and then there's also another part that comes off Ardsley Lane, which is a private access.
I think the access way would have been provided through, I don't have the map available, but through this point in here.
Drove up there when we did our site visit.
Just for the record, we tweet that question coming from Commissioner Bauer because Commissioner Bauman has declared a conflict of interest on this matter and won't be taking any part in the deliberations. Sorry, I should have announced that earlier.
Yeah.
But submitter is known to Commissioner Bauman. Yes. Yeah, so we'll take that question as a question from about the road from Commissioner Bauer. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, Charles, yeah, Charles, in the 42A report, there's a comment that says subject to MPS HPL. The question is, has this application gone through the same process with regards to clause 3.10 as Daniel's had to go through?
Yes. So this property was in that initial section 42A report I did for hearing stream 3. Ag First considered all of the submission requests based on this property. It met the criteria. So I guess the crops that could have been appropriate for this property were not considered to be economically viable.
It was one of, if not the only one of
It
two.
was the only property that
meet the criteria.
is right.
I think you covered that up in your summary statement, didn't you? Yep. Paragraph 6. Sorry, only indirectly. Yes.
Yes.
So, having dealt with HDL, it then came down to servicing and flooding and transportation matters. The committee has provided some expert evidence on now.
That's right. Yes.
Craig, did you have a first?
I took that.
Yes, sorry about my fault. I should have mentioned that.
No, I'm fine, thanks, David.
Brian?
I've just got one, and whether I direct it at you, Charles, or later on. The groundwater, the ground suitable for 93 lots or 58 hectares of water disposal. I noticed the soil reports say it has poor internal drainage. I'm just wondering whether soakage tests have been done or the ground has been assessed properly.
Right. There might be a better question for the submitter. And given I don't have my own expert here, I'd probably be they'd be better to answer that in first instance.
Thank you.
That's Mr. Steve Watt, isn't it?
That's right. Yes.
Yes. But Mr. Watt presumably had an opportunity to review Mr. Floyd's evidence.
He did. So his conclusions were that he did have some preliminary thinking on what stormwater devices would be necessary, but considered that it would be reasonable to manage that through a subdivision consent. So I guess the key matter we need to consider here is, are there significant constraints that would mean that we just couldn't manage that at a subdivision stage?
And the entry level for subdivision would be?
At this stage, it's controlled.
Yes.
As I've alluded to in my hearing statement, due to those roading issues and I guess an unknown there as to whether they can actually provide that. At this stage, I'd be recommending as a minimum restricted discretionary.
Yes. So in terms of the servicing constraints, do the matters of control, are they sufficient to deal with the matters that Mr. Watt raised?
Yes. So that they have they need to meet there's some specific standards for stormwater and wastewater, which would provide that sufficient scope for, I guess, discussing those different options and what is the most appropriate.
Are those standards requirements to maintain a controlled activity status?
Yes.
And if they're not maintained, it goes to?
It would go to restricted discretionary if those standards weren't maintained.
Right. And are you thinking of a similar preconditioned standard, if you like, in terms of transport that would stipulate a certain outcome, and if that's not met, it would go to RDA, or are you thinking of an entry level for RDA on this property?
I guess at this stage, I don't have confidence that either of the roading options could be provided, so I don't think there'd be an entry level we could add to be controlled.
So it would need to be quite a bespoke solution.
That's right.
Yes. And you haven't had an opportunity to discuss that with Mr. McPennell yet?
I haven't, no. I guess to clarify for the internal access road off Ardsley Lane, that may well be feasible, but given it's a privately owned lane, there's obviously we don't know yet.
Sure.
That will be feasible.
Yes. And as far as access of State Highway 2 is concerned, there was no bespoke submission in opposition to the zoning by NCTA, was there? Further submission?
That's right.
But we know that they will have an interest, given what's happened elsewhere in Masterton District last couple of years with access onto highways from residential development.
Mm.
I was just going to say around the NZTA. I know that's it could be the possibility that NZTA thought this matter was concluded and have not seen your report, so I think we have to be quite careful.
Yes, although Craig, they didn't lodge first right at the very beginning when the zoning request was put in. So
it's surprising.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
I guess maybe actually to clarify on that point, in all other circumstances, so residential subdivision, understand at the moment it goes straight to discretionary. And in the general rural zone, for the bespoke lifestyle, there's also a trigger to push that up to discretionary. With the rural lifestyle zone, given it didn't have a interface with the state highway, there wasn't any specific provision for that. So it may have been, I guess, from NZTA's perspective, they obviously wouldn't have had concern with the proposed extent, whereas the specific extent would be of particular concern, potential concern.
We'll hear from submitted this afternoon. They're online at the moment. Are you anticipating some direct discussion regarding a bespoke rule framework to deal with this one outstanding matter?
Yes, I would anticipate hearing from Mr. McDonald on any suggestions he has, if he's in general agreement with the approach I've suggested here for a restricted discretionary, or if he has further thought to how that might be appropriately managed through the current rule framework.
Thank you for that.
So, John, we close it. Can you just zoom in and I'm just trying to get my bearings on where this is again?
Just on that
So
end there.
it doesn't include this, but it does. It comes up here and then comes across.
So borders on, that's Ladymead, that's the kennels there, is it?
Yes.
Right, so it's that big block in there.
Yeah.
Right, now I understand what it's.
No further questions, panel?
Not really.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Sorry, because it's. Privately owned land up there. It's that boundary there. It's my understanding.
Yes, it might. Yeah, you're right.
Oh, right, just go all the way.
You can see it.
And go all over that road again, same road.
It might be worth.
Is this the old, the horse, the horse stuff? Oh, right, okay. Oh, it's the old horse stuff, right.
Yeah.
Okay, I know exactly what it is. Yeah.
It might be worth clarifying this further with the submitted this afternoon to ensure you're aware of the full extent.
If you'd ripped the horse stuff there, I'd know exactly.
We can take paragraph 30 as read. That's what we're doing. It's the goes over property, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Daniel,
Sorry. Daniel. And do you want to take us through paragraph 31 and 32?
Yes, so the matters that remain in contention are those listed in A to D. So point A is whether to rezone the 254 State Highway 2 from rural, general rural to rural lifestyle. It is noted, in principle, I'm in support, but I would like to have that further clarified as to how those roading effects will be managed. So B to D relate to submitters who hadn't submitted expert evidence. You haven't heard from these previously or in this statement. So 75 Evans Road, which is Hamish Qualthrough, 52 Chamberlain Road, 66 Chamberlain Road, 78 Chamberlain Road, and 114 Chamberlain Road from general rural to rural lifestyle, which is Audrey Rendell. And then Boundary Road, Donald's Road, and the lower portion of Noatawa Road, which is from general rural to rural lifestyle. And that is, there's two main submitters there, and then three further submitters, including Mr. Ryan, who'll be appearing after lunch. And then 32 was just to note those B to D have not provided further expert evidence.
Hearing from Simon Coffey and Sally Whitehead, or Janine Brown, are we?
Not no.
But we're hearing from Mr. Ryan. Yeah, almost marking that. Who deals with one of those a larger property, 150.
Yes.
That's in support of the Coffee and Whitehead.
That's right. Rezoning request.
Yes, so that's, he's covering one property at 150. Whereas there were 10 properties covered by the Coffee and Whitehead. Right, okay. Start. Okay, well, I don't have any further questions, Mr. Hall. I'm back today or tomorrow. The directions we talked about. Hey, Ms. Malone. Hey, should we go through to 12:30? I don't know that we'll get through it all before then. But we'll afford ourselves some time this afternoon. So maybe to just indulge with some others by pushing them back a little bit. I don't want you to rush this unnecessarily because this is probably the most contested of all of the reports. Yeah. Just take us through that. I think we can probably take that minor error as read. And the NZTA matter looks like that's resolved also. Yeah. So why don't we start at section 2 on page 2?
Cooperative district plan contains 4 primary zones: rural, residential, commercial and industrial, which have been migrated to the most closely matched zone under the national planning standards. The NPS came into effect in November 2019 and introduced a nationally consistent set of zones. In line with the zone framework standard, district plans must only include zones listed in table 13. Would you like me to go through that table, or you can see it a couple of times?
I've seen it a couple of times, but we know that the grey road does apply in this instance.
That's right. 5 additional zones were proposed that don't have an equivalent zone, being the open spaces zones, the rural lifestyle zone and multi-purpose zone. Unlike South Wairarapa District Council and Carterton District Council, Masterton did not have an overarching spatial plan as guidance to assist with zoning under the proposed district plan review. Currently, work is underway to develop a spatial plan and it's at its scoping phase.
I'd like you to just talk briefly to that. Where's the Masterton spatial plan at currently?
Very early scoping phase at the moment.
And did it have any public consultation?
No, not yet.
So just formulating options and ideas, collecting information.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Demographic information, population information.
Yes, scope.
Dero Razor, what happened to the Masterton Urban Growth, commonly known as the market?
I'm not too sure.
Christine, are you able to?
I can't, Mr. Chairman. So the Masterton Urban Growth Strategy that was developed in 2018 or 2019, I believe.
Yes.
Went through and that was reviewed again in 2022. Buffer did a review of that, and it just came out more as a, so just to take you back through the 2019 document, it was never endorsed by council.
Yes.
It was just a
Sure.
internal document that was used to guide some, to give us some direction. That document was then reviewed again in 2022, and again, it was updated, but only as an internal document.
Yes. Okay. And does it have a life currently, or is it now on the shelf?
It is currently on the shelf as we look to go into our spatial plan.
Okay. And a couple of other questions. Given that the spatial plan is currently at the early stages, what's the likely timetable for its development? What are the key steps?
You mean for the spatial plan?
Spatial plan.
That work will begin this year, and it's likely to be concluded probably in early 2026. Or between 2026 is our date of publishing.
So they're publishing it for engagement, or is that as a final?
I can talk to engagement. So we were wanting to do the early consultation before August this year.
Yes. Okay. So the conclusion in 2026 would be a final spatial plan.
Document.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's great. That's just some context. As I said earlier, Section 42A authors had talked about upcoming spatial plans, and particularly this one, and just to give submitters some confidence that there was another avenue to pursue. So I wanted to understand how realistic that might be. Okay, now shall we proceed to Section 3?
A total of 16 original submissions and 15 further submissions were received in relation to rezoning land within the Masterton district. Submissions were generally in opposition of the notified zoning, and while they varied in zoning sought, those seeking the same zoning had similar reasoning. For example, requests relating to rezoning from general rural zone to general residential zone or future urban zone commonly sought more land be provided for housing development outside of the urban boundary. Those seeking land be rezoned to a centre zone, i.e. a town centre zone or mixed-use zone, sought the change to enable more activities to be permitted without requiring resource consent or to better reflect the existing use of a site. I have read the respective evidence submitted in relation to Masterton rezoning requests, being that of Mr. Anderson for Juice Brothers Limited.
Take that, those as read. The only thing I'd note here is you won't be looking at Mr. McDonnell's evidence any further because he hasn't, and not seeking to pursue that.
Point G.
Point G.
Oh, yes. That's right.
We can go straight on to ET quests if you like.
Ms. McWilliam and Mr. Lovett, on behalf of E2 Quest Limited, seek the property comprising 248 High Street be rezoned from general residential zone to mixed-use zone. I acknowledge that Ms. William has pointed out an error within my Section 42A report, paragraphs 122 and 129, where I refer to residential visitor accommodation being within the existing environment, which should have read visitor accommodation, noting the two have different definitions. I note that the general area contains 4 sites used for visitor accommodation.
Just while you're talking, could someone bring this site up on the screen? Just solitude. Thank you. Just you can carry on. Thank you.
I'm very familiar with this area of Masterton, and when driving east along High Street, the left side of the road appears commercial in nature, with the right side more residential. As shown on the GIS maps, the area surrounding the submitter's site to the north and the west is mostly residential in nature, with commercial uses such as other visitor accommodation businesses, a Harvey Norman store and 700 metre squared retail block, and other mixed-use activities further down the road. And that's further east. The submitter's property is 2.14 hectares in size, with a large area of undeveloped land. And Ms. McWilliam notes that the general residential zoning will restrict any future extension of the existing visitor accommodation. I agree that any extension of the existing visitor accommodation would require a resource consent as a discretionary activity under Rule GRZR16, whereas it did not require a resource consent under the operative plan. Ms. McWilliam also notes that other visitor accommodation activities are on small lots compatible with the general residential zone, with little room to expand. Therefore, the zone change will not affect these to the same extent, given they have also got existing use rights. I understand Ms. McWilliam's position. To help the panel to understand the extent of visitor accommodation activities in this area, I've included a map in Appendix 4 among the mixed use and residential areas. As mentioned in my Section 42A report, all land that was zoned commercial, including this property and wider area, was assessed against the new commercial zones to determine which were most appropriate. It was determined that this general area no longer reflected the role, function, character, and qualities of a commercial zone. This, and noting the large volume of residential properties, meant that the general residential zone was considered the most appropriate, as opposed to town centre zone, neighbourhood centre zone, or mixed-use zone. Albeit, I acknowledge that this site does not fit perfectly into any of the zones. Figures 3 and 4 of Ms. McWilliam's evidence provides insight into the extent of the zoning change in this area. Ms. McWilliam has clarified that the submitter may seek the following future uses at the site. A, being an expansion of the existing visitor accommodation, and B, large-scale commercial activities, for example, a supermarket, large format retail activities, and trade supplier activities. In my Section 42A report, I noted that the general residential zone could give objective and policy support for visitor accommodation within the general residential zone. I acknowledge that Ms. McWilliam disagrees with this. My opinion was based on considering an expansion of the visitor accommodation at this particular property. Upon reflection, I do agree with Ms. McWilliam that objective GRZ03, non-residential activities, does not provide clear support. While I considered GRZP3 provides policy support, I did not consider that GRZ03 clearly defines compatible non-residential activities, which visitor accommodation does not meet either. For convenience, I've included the latest versions of these below. I won't read those two out unless you'd like me to. Okay. This is not to say it would not be assessed on its merits through a resource consent process, as it would be considered within the context of the specific site, taking into account the existing visitor accommodation activity, the site containing relatively large setbacks to boundaries, existing visitor accommodation along one boundary, that's the eastern boundary, and the mixture of activities along the stretch of state highway. I retain that seeking an expansion of commercial activity in this area be through a resource consent process rather than spot zoning one site, also noting no other submissions were received in relation to this area. Ms. McWilliam has identified possible future uses as A and B, as mentioned above. Under the general residential zone rules, all of the above would require resource consent as a discretionary activity. Under GRZR15, commercial activities, or GRZR16, any other activity. If the site was zoned mixed-use zone, an expansion of visitor accommodation and trade supplier activities would be permitted under Rule MUZR6 and Rule MUZR9. Large format retail would be discretionary under MUZR14, and a supermarket would be discretionary under MUZR15. Although permitted under the mixed-use zone rule framework, I note both visitor accommodation and trade supplier activities would require a resource consent where they become high traffic generating activities or require any new vehicle crossings under rules TRR1 and TRR5 due to the location of the state highway.
Just on that point in relation to the visitor accommodation, is there a threshold for traffic numbers to trigger the high traffic generating rule, or is it solely that they have access onto the highway? What's the trigger for?
I believe it's the access of the state highway, but I'll just need to check.
High Street is state highway, isn't it?
Yes.
Would it have an effect though, given that it's inside the town boundary in a 50-kilometre zone?
70 k's there.
Gone now, gone back to 0.
Oh, it's gone back. It'll go back to 50 again sometime.
So
Well, probably still.
goes back to the thresholds in TR 29,
Hang on. Yeah,
29,
yes.
and that includes the general residential zone.
Yes.
And it's got in their average traffic generation threshold.
What's the metric?
So daily traffic generation is 200 vehicles per day.
Yes.
Hourly traffic generation is 25 vehicles per hour. And heavy vehicle movement is 10 heavy vehicle movements per day.
So movement, vehicle movements, are they?
Oh, yes, that's right, vehicle movements. And then you have table TR17, which is average daily traffic generation, and it's got residential development, retirement. There's
Is there visitor accommodation? What's the term? Visitor accommodation?
no, there isn't.
The question I need an answer on is whether visitor accommodation would trigger a high traffic generating rule and move from permitted activity to DA, is it, or RDA? I can't remember. You can come back to me on that if you want.
Yes, please.
It's something I want to discuss with Ms. McWilliams this afternoon.
There's no.
So 27.
Retain my position as set out in my section 42A report that Marsden District Council prefers that any additional commercial activities or expansion of non-residential activities in this area managed through the resource consent process. I accept the opinion of Ms McWilliams and Mr Lovett that there is limited availability of large commercial sites to accommodate large format retail activities, but there are some sites to the north of the site and to the west. Regardless, large format retail is a discretionary activity under both the general residential zone and the mixed use zone.
I don't think anyone's disputing that. It's just the status of status of visitor accommodation, whether it does change status. Yeah. I interrupted you.
No problem. As mentioned in my section 42A report, all commercial land was looked at as to the most appropriate commercial zone out of the town centre zone mixed use and neighbourhood centre. In the absence of any large format retail zoning in Marsden, and considering there is no option to further expand and the activity is an existing use, the site comprising Harvey Norman was zoned neighbourhood centre zone. For those sites comprising visitor accommodation and surrounding, the general residential zone was considered more appropriate in relation to the surrounding residential use. At this stage, I retain my existing position that the site be zoned general residential zone consistent with the zoning in the general area. While I acknowledge there are a mixture of uses along the stretch of state highway, it is preferred that any commercial use or expansion go through assessment under the resource consent process.
Question, where the Copthorne Solway site is, the zoning on that is
Residential.
general, so, okay.
So my appendix 4
Yeah.
shows it a bit of
Yeah.
overview.
I just wanted it on the record that the Copthorne's, I just wanted it on record that the Copthorne Solway site is general residential.
Yes.
We haven't received any submissions about that from.
No, we haven't.
Yeah. That's separate, so this,
Yes, Craig.
That's an interesting point that was just brought up.
Yes.
I'm just,
do you want to speak up for the mic?
sorry, I'm just digesting the point that you just brought up there.
Yes. So the point being that the adjoining operation, the Solway
Yes.
has not sort of changed to the residential zoning, PDP. Notwithstanding that
It's
site
all
and the submitted site were both zoned commercial under the operative plan. Which just raises a question in my mind, and I don't know if you were involved, Alice, but was the under the district plan review before the draft plan was produced, what was the underlying thinking about the change in zoning there?
I believe it was to better reflect the existing environment, being there's a lot of residential development now in that area. So,
Yeah, Copthorne Solway, am I right? They sold off, they had a driving range at the back and that was sold off and that is now general residential, isn't it? Yeah.
Was the this site by ET West Limited actually shown as residential in the draft plan that was out for consultation?
oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it was.
I think so.
I can find that out.
It was definitely notified as residential in the proposed district plan. The you've obviously had some discussions with Ms. McFoy about this. And she shared with you what the long-term plans might be for the site. You split that into an A and B. Find there.
So that's in paragraph 22.
Yes. Expansion of the existing visitor accommodation. Just for the record again, acknowledging that there'll be existing consents in place and existing use rights associated with those consents. If those consents and existing rights can't be relied on, and the expansion of the existing visitor accommodation requires a consent under the proposed residential zone, are you saying that that would be a permitted activity, provided that all relevant standards are met?
Permitted activity in the residential zone
Yes.
For expansion of visitor accommodation.
Yes.
No, it would be discretionary.
And that's regardless of whether the high traffic generating rule is met, applies or not.
That's right.
Okay. You had said.
You might be referring, so if it was rezoned mixed use zone, visitor accommodation and trade supplies would be permitted.
Okay, yes, got it, yes. And that's where the high traffic generating rule might.
It was that regardless, it may trigger a discretionary status,
Yes.
whether or not.
Yes, I understand. Okay, so just to summarise, residential visitor accommodation is a discretionary activity in residential zone under the proposed plan. Under mixed use zone, it would be permitted, subject to meeting standards. Didn't meet those standards, it might go to RDA. But if it didn't, if the high traffic generating rule applied, it will go to discretionary. And for the large format and trade discretionary activity in the residential zone and discretionary activity in the mixed use zone?
For trade, it would be permitted.
For trade, it would be permitted, okay.
The high traffic generating activity table may bump that to discretion.
Again. But large format is discretionary in both zones.
Yes.
Large format's even discretionary in the residential.
Yes. Delayed.
Interesting.
Did we miss something here? We're going from commercial zone to general residential zone where clearly and you've got that hotel and commercial activity within there. Have we sort of made a mistake here, for want of a better term, that we should have actually carved this out to begin with when we put this together?
In terms of zoning,
I'm sort of struggling how we go from a commercial zone where there's commercial activity, and it's not just the sun, it's Copthorne, and then it's the Harvey Norman, is it? That big block. That's clearly commercial under the old logic. And then we've just gone, oh, there's houses around, let's redo it. So carving out that little bit and saying, keep that as a mixed use zone.
yeah, this was one of the challenging parts because it is relatively mixed along State Highway 2, but it is quite residential around.
But that's a very defined block along. It's literally from the block we're talking about to
Yeah.
the end of Harvey Norman. That's, you know, you'd have to be blind to say that's not commercial as you drive past, as you rightly say, you drive past all the time. So
Yeah.
no one's going to mistake that as residential.
Yes, from State Highway 2, it looks commercial in nature.
So we're creating a problem and creating an expense for those existing businesses by rezoning it as residential. Are we limiting what they can do for the sake of consent where it's already clearly a commercial area?
Sort of what I'm trying to establish. I asked what was the reason for changing the zone?
Yeah,
And I've also asked what the implications of changing the zone would be in terms of the activity status. And it's mainly a application for the expansion of the visitor
They also mention
visitor accommodation.
or large scale commercial activity. So supermarket, large format retail. So I guess they see Harvey Norman up the road. So maybe something similar to that. And it says also trade supplier activities.
Sure, yes. But we'll take those points out with Ms. McWilliam.
yeah. So can I just ask a question? If we were reminded to say, okay, yeah, we made a particular, we should have been a bit more nuanced about how we did this. Is there anything to stop us carving out that block that includes the Harvey Norman, going back to mixed use sort of figures for that whole area?
Scope provided by the scope provided by this submitter is to rezone the land.
That's their block. But,
Yes,
but the whole lot has been,
there's no, hang on.
that whole area.
There's no scope to change the Copthorne, but there is scope to change the Harvey Norman site. And in fact, it's been rezoned neighbourhood centre, I think, the proposed plan. The submitter wants a town centre zone. The submitter is not providing any additional evidence that these proceedings above what are provided in here in stream 2.
That sort of, that would make it even more ridiculous because you'd have this block in the middle.
So
These are matters.
Whether we have scope or not.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what I'm asking. Is it?
Matters for deliberation.
Just a follow-on question, and we touched upon it in a previous presentation at the Wainawa site. Will the rezoning of this from commercial to residential, and I'm specifically talking about Copthorne here, what impact does that have on their rates at part?
I'm not sure the impact on rates.
Thinking pen charges.
Huh?
You thinking pen charges?
Because commercial has a differential.
It's a academic question, but we don't have scope to deal with it.
No.
Okay, any further questions?
But that may be a reason why there was no submission put forward. It's out of scope, I get it.
Who knows? Right,
That's it.
right.
Can I be excused?
Yes, yes, you do.
Yeah.
That's fine. We're going to be breaking soon anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, let's, there's a lot of questions for Mr. McWilliam there. Your position set out in paragraph 30 at this stage, you're sticking with your 6.2 report. And you'll hear what comes out of the questioning afternoon.
Yes, and I do understand her position as well.
Let's move on to Mr. Hart.
Mr. Russell Hooper has submitted planning evidence on behalf of further submitted Tim Hart, further submitted to the submission by Stephen and Judith Brown. The original submission sought properties along Namatawa Road to West Bush Road be rezoned from general rural zone to mixed use zone. The evidence relates to the further submitted property alone being 150 Namatawa Road, identified in Mr. Hooper's evidence. I concur with Mr. Hooper's summary of the resource consents approved over the site originally for beekeeping equipment and operations, and now to operate a machinery hire company. Mr. Hooper notes a mixed-use zone would provide for a range of appropriate activities to occur as a permitted activity without the uncertainty and added expense and time associated with the resource consent process. While I do agree with Mr. Hooper that the site has been used for commercial activities for some time, I do not consider this alone justifies a rezoning. I note that existing resource consent provided written approval from the adjoining landowner, 5 West Bush Road, and as a result, the consent holder included plans to add a 1 metre high shade cloth to the top of the shed and placement of lighting, so not to increase light spill toward the neighbour.
I just ask you to pause here. Would you better bring this property up also, please?
Do you want help finding it at Solitaire?
Let's jump back onto the next.
150 Tower Road. Please proceed.
Generally, the mixed-use zone adjoins the town centre zone or industrial zone, but it has also been included next to the general residential zone. As far as mixed-use zone 04 into zone management, the objective does not include protecting the general rural zone from adverse effects of activities. Furthermore, Mr. Hooper refers to this activity as commercial, and I note that the only commercial activities permitted in the mixed-use zone is trade supply activities. It's unclear whether the existing activity is commercial or industrial, and whether it would be permitted or require resource consent. I acknowledge that if the activity were expanded, the mixed-use zone provides greater objective and policy support for a commercial or an industrial activity.
So that's that long strip between Bush Road and
I disagree with Mr. Hooper's conclusion that because the activity is already established, that policy GRUZ P6 is met as far as reverse sensitivity, especially as the evidence refers to providing an opportunity for new commercial activities at the site. Mitigation of adverse effects on the neighbouring property were accounted for in the resource consent, but the mixed-use zone does not talk to mitigation. I have given some further thought to this since the time I've written my summary statement. So I'm just wondering if I can touch on that now, probably more appropriate. So I did have a look through the mixed-use zone again, and I do consider that it does talk to reverse sensitivity under MUZP4, and MUZP5 does talk to managing effects on other areas, and while rural zones isn't listed in the front end, it is further down in MUZP5A, and B talks to screening. So I've had a little bit of a shift in opinion. So, and that's just regard to reverse sensitivity. I think it actually could be managed between the mixed use zone and general rural zone.
Should put that in writing.
Well,
but I'll just put that reserve between mixed use zone and the adjoining of proposed mixed zone and the adjoining GRUZ could be managed.
Yes.
That's reference to policy 5 A and B.
Yes.
Which deals with screening.
Yes.
Where you at here?
I am at paragraph 36. I acknowledge the reasons Mr. Hooper has put forth to support the rezoning request, but question what Mr. Hooper means when stating that it would enable economic development in a manner that manages adverse effects. And while I agree it may provide certainty to the landowner as far as future expansion, the activity is consented as it is currently. There is an opportunity to further evaluate the extension of urban zoning in this location through the spatial plan process, but at this stage, I retain the site remain in the general rural zone.
And are you talking solely about Mr. Hart's property here, or are you talking also about the properties raised by Stephen and Judy Brown?
Yeah, I was just talking about 150.
150.
As that's the further evidence that I've received.
Yeah.
As far as the other properties, I retain my position in my section 42A.
Yes, and that's at paragraphs 132 and 142 of 42A, which is a recommended rejection. Is there anything to different, in your view, anything that differentiates 150 from the other 9 properties that are to the south?
Other than the fact that the site has been consented for commercial use twice now.
Just like, hang out a little bit so we can see those other properties in the top.
And
Boundary Road.
yeah, it's closer to the urban zone than other properties.
If you look at page 28 of the 42A report, above paragraph 132, it's a plan that shows those other 9 properties, but essentially they're snuggled around that intersection and the V.
Yes.
To the north.
Yes,
That
to the
intersection.
yes, yes. And they follow cadastral boundaries. What are the activities on those other properties?
Building is,
Yeah, you've listed them at paragraph 1, 3 and 4. Yeah.
Non-consent.
Yeah, it's hard to know if they would have needed it either without knowing the scale. Yeah.
So putting aside whether they're consented or not, or whether they need a consent, those 9 properties and the property on the corner, Mr. Hart's property, all contain some form of industrial activity.
I'm not sure if all of them do. Some of them do.
Some of them. I see, it was 4 of the 9. Yes. This,
And that's 4 of the 9 actually, so it's only 3 of the 3 of the other 9 do, because highways is 150, so only 4 of the 10 use totality.
all 10 sites, one on Mr. Hart's property and the other 9 are all subject to the MPS HPL, according to your 42A report.
Yes, however, Mr. Hooper has mentioned that 150 Namatara Road is not.
You accept that?
Just want to double check. I know it has been consented for, it's non-rural.
I don't think there's any grass there because I think it's all under concrete.
It is all under concrete.
Yeah.
So it's only productive now.
I will just check the soil maps.
Your 42A report didn't dealt with all 10 properties together, didn't it? It's your summary statement that just did it.
Yes. So there's a tiny portion of what looks like land use class 3 at the southwestern end of the property, but it's minuscule.
Okay.
The rest is not.
Yeah, all of that is sort of concrete and that's.
And how does that compare to the 9 properties to the south in terms of their intersection with class 1, 2 or 3 land?
The rest are completely covered in class 3.
The digger stone mason area is probably quite contaminated.
Hasn't been any agricultural or economic evidence. What has there?
No.
Okay, and we'll hear from Mr. Hooper later. Later today. Okay, going team with work.
30.
I think we will take a short lunch adjournment because we've got the June property survey. And we've got Eastleigh consider. And we've got Sunburn and Greater Wellington because we're not dealing with Wallace or Les or Lefty.
That's one. Yeah.
Oops, 1:15. At 1 more. We convene at 1:15. Parents adjourned within